When university students take my courses, even those who start out knowing virtually nothing about Russian history, they've usually heard of the Romanovs and the end of the family dynasty during the Russian Revolution. And usually, what they know has to do with the Princess Anastasia, whom they've discovered at the hands of two former Walt Disney animators. The movie is a musical adventure that was actually made for 20th Century Fox and is based on the legend that an orphan princess escaped her family's execution. It features the voices of the actors Meg Ryan, John Cusack, Kelsey Grammer, and Angela Lansbury. And it made about $140 million at the box office. Invariably, a student will raise her hand and ask, "Is it true?" Right away, I'll know what she's talking about. And I always feel badly when I have to say, "No, it's not." Anastasia, the daughter of the Zhar Nicholas II, and his wife Alexandra, didn't survive. Neither did her parents, 3 sisters, or brother, nor the loyal servants who were with them. In spite of the tales spun by Hollywood and some convincing pretenders who kept the tabloids busy for years, the last Romanov emperor and his family were executed in cold blood a century ago in a merchant's basement at the provincial Russian town of Ekaterinburg. Today's lecture will tell the real story of the Romanov dynasty, from its rise to power in 1613 until its bloody end in 1918. It's a drama that's so filled with adventure, intrigue, romance, and heartbreak that you couldn't make it up. The groundwork for Romanov rule was laid by the Rurik dynasty of the 15th century, led by Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of all the Russias, until his death in 1584. The Ruriks reclaimed Russian sovereignty from the Mongols. They oversaw the establishment of a separate Russian Orthodox Church, built the Kremlin, and expanded into non-Slavic lands to forge the Russian Empire. Ivan, from the moment of his coronation, claimed the title of Zhar. But he also precipitated a tumultuous period known as the Time of Troubles, after he struck and killed his son and heir. Once Ivan died, his successors maintained a semblance of order for almost 2 decades. His younger son, Fyodor, succeeded to the throne in 1584 and ruled until his own death in 1598. But in name only. Fyodor was intellectually incapacitated and relied upon regents to rule for him. The first was an uncle, the second, his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. When the childless Fyodor died, the Rurik line disappeared as well. Hoping to maintain a period of relative stability, leading nobles agreed that Fyodor's brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, would succeed him as Tsar. But then, famine gripped Russia, and resentment against Godunov escalated. A pretender posing as the dead Prince Dmitry now invaded Russia from Poland. Posing as Ivan the Terrible's young son, who died years before in 1591 at the age of 9, he was advancing on Moscow when Godunov died himself in 1605. Godunov's death facilitated the false Dmitry's ascension to power as the new Tsar. But peace and stability were not to be. The first false Dmitry was overthrown and killed within a year. Other claimants temporarily seized power, including a second false Dmitry. And central authority effectively fell apart. Polish forces temporarily occupied the Kremlin. But by 1612, a grassroots army, led by a butcher and a nobleman, claimed the Kremlin. And they vanquished the nobles who'd collaborated with the Polish invaders. With both the Poles and more than one false Dmitry now out of the picture, and the Rurik line extinguished, the pressing question was, what next? At the start of 1613, a specially convened Assembly of the Land, the Russian term is Zemsky Sobor, decided the issue. Consisting of about 500 nobles called boyars, lesser gentry, clergy, merchants, and even some peasants, The Zemsky Sobor selected as the new Tsar the 16-year-old great-nephew of Ivan's beloved first wife, Anastasia. This was the young Mikhail Romanov, who had no strong personal connection to the throne. He didn't even know his aunt. She died before he was born. On the other hand, Mikhail Romanov's father, Fyodor, had been a major political player in the Kremlin until he'd run afoul of Boris Godunov. It's a bit complicated, like a chain car wreck on the interstate. After the Rurik line died out, Fyodor Romanov and Boris Godunov both aspired to greater power. And when Godunov gained the upper hand, he disposed of his rival. But instead of killing Fyodor and making him a martyr and a potential source of sedition, Godunov forced him to become a monk. Godunov now also exiled the Romanov family, including the very young Mikhail. Then Godunov died, and Fyodor rose to prominence in the Russian Orthodox Church. Now known as Filaret, he became the Metropolitan of Rostov. That is, he rose to the Russian Orthodox Church's position of highest ecclesiastical authority in the town of Rostov, northeast of Moscow. But when the Poles were driven out of the Kremlin, they took Filaret back to Poland as their prisoner, and he was still in prison there when his son was selected Zhar. Mikhail Romanov first balked at the idea of assuming power. He and his mother had taken refuge at a monastery in Kostroma, about 80 miles or 130 kilometers northeast of Rostov. He expressed no interest in the intrigues at the Kremlin. He was also quite young and unrelated by blood to the Rurik line. But these were exactly the reasons why the Zemsky Sobor selected him. He had no old scores to settle or allies to reward, and his aunt Anastasia, the one he'd never known, was still fondly remembered. Over the greater part of the next 2 decades, Mikhail reestablished the social order and stability needed for the country to move forwards. Mikhail died in 1645. When he did, his son and successor, Alexei, achieved further advances. In 1649, Alexei presided over one of the most momentous developments of his 31-year reign, the establishment of a new law code called the Ulozhenie. Among other things, the Ulozhenie formalized the Russian system of serfdom, which tied the Russian peasantry to manorial estates. Government record books were now established to register the peasants. Alexei's expansion of the state and the power of the nobility elicited resentment from those on the losing end of the arrangements. This prompted numerous uprisings. The most significant was the Stenka Razin rebellion on Russia's southeastern frontier from 1670 to 1671. It's named for a Cossack leader who'd grown up at a time when runaway serfs were escaping to settle in Cossack settlements. Razin led a band of these landless migrants who profitably raided existing settlements and some of the Tsar's fortress cities. Many peasants gladly conspired with Razin against their noble landlords. Yet they did so while typically expressing loyalty to the distant Tsar, as they would right up until the 20th century. Razin billed himself as fighting against the nobles and for the Tsar, even when he was marching against Alexei's forces. So whatever else might be said about this rebellion, which came with a full complement of atrocities, profiteering and drunken orgies, it makes clear that the new Romanov dynasty inherited the peasantry's traditional reverence and affection for the Tsar as their rightful ruler. He was God's divinely ordained representative, and commoners blamed their problems not on him, but rather on the heavy-handed hand of their noble landlords. A Russian proverb captured this benign view of the serfs' highest authorities this way: God is in the heavens and the Tsar is far away. In spite of Razin's friendly proclamations, Alexei was unpersuaded. So when Razin was at last captured in 1671, Alexei had him quartered alive. This gruesome form of execution symbolized the powerful vengeance of the crown. To be quartered meant that a condemned person's arms and legs were tied to 4 different horses. The men overseeing the execution sent the horses off in 4 different directions, literally ripping the prisoner apart. After this horrific death, Razin's dismembered body was thrown to the dogs. The message of Stenka Razin's public execution was clear. Were the Zhar to be challenged, he was determined to demonstrate his family's authority and vengeance. By the time Alexei died in 1676, Romanov rule was firmly established. And now Peter Romanov, Peter the Great, took the crown and transformed Russia into a great European state. Peter realized something that other European monarchs of the age already knew. That is that the manifest power of the state needed to be more constantly visible. So he and his 18th century Romanov successors sought to demonstrate their divinely ordained absolute power through Baroque and Rococo art and architecture. From the time Peter the Great moved Russia's capital to St. Petersburg in 1703, the city became the main stage on which the autocracy demonstrated its culture, influence, and power. At the same time, danger increasingly lurked there. Court intrigue would topple 3 different emperors from 1741 until 1801. And in the years to come, it was in St. Petersburg that Russian revolutionaries known as the Decembrists, who came from the upper class and military, called in 1825 for the creation of a free Russian state, along with a federal government and constitution. It was there that a popular movement known as the People's Will adopted terrorist practices and targeted and killed the Romanov Zhar, Alexander II, in 1881. And it was in the Romanovs' capital, when pushed to the brink by the upheavals of the First World War, a revolution initiated by angry, hungry subjects would finally topple the Romanov autocracy in 1917. Each generation of Romanovs sought to lead in its own fashion, often recognizing the vulnerabilities of the autocratic state and how the backwardness of peasant society shackled the economy. But each also understood the Goldilocks dilemma of stolen porridge. Too much reform was too hot, and too little was too cool. And it seemed they could never get it just right. Alexander II undertook one of Russia's single greatest reforms in his Emancipation Manifesto of 1861 that ended serfdom on Russia's private estates, nearly 2 years before Abraham Lincoln freed United States slaves. But after Alexander was murdered in the streets of his own capital, his son and successor, Alexander III, concluded, this is what reform brings you. Only reaction and repression came from Alexander III. With vigor, he went after the terrorist group, the People's Will, which had murdered his father. In a few years, the terrorists were all executed, imprisoned, or driven into exile. Alexander also tightened censorship, ended university autonomy, and expanded the ability of the Russian police, the Okhrana, to ruthlessly target radicals and revolutionaries. And he reasserted the power of the autocracy in the church. He was promoting the cause of elites at the expense of workers and peasants. He was upholding the positions of ethnic Russians at the expense of ethnic and religious minorities. No one was in greater awe of Alexander III than his eldest son and heir, Nicholas. And when Alexander III died in 1894, no one was more terrified. In the hours after his father's death, a dejected Nicholas proclaimed, "I'm not prepared to be Tsar. I don't even know how to talk to ministers." He didn't share these misgivings publicly, though, and they were nowhere on display when he took the crown. An American journalist who covered the coronation marveled at the official ceremonies, seeing in them a manifestation of the emperor's power. Another onlooker remarked that the sight made clear that there was nothing equal on earth to the might of the Russian monarch, according to Columbia University historian Richard Wortman in his book, Scenarios of Power, Myth, and Ceremony in Russian Monarchy. Still, clouds hung ominously over the start of Nicholas II's reign. So that the Russian masses could express adoration for the new Tsar and gratitude to the Romanov dynasty, a banquet was arranged on Khodinskaya Field near Moscow. Unfortunately, larger than expected crowds and poor planning led to a stampede in which 1,389 Russians died. To make matters worse, Nicholas and his wife Alexandra didn't cancel the subsequent coronation festivities and balls. This was a typical misstep. The new Tsar's political instincts often led him astray, and he was ill-suited to be an autocrat. He preferred spending time outside of the capital with his wife, their 4 daughters, and son Alexei, to the dreary business of ruling. Perhaps there were moments in Russian history when a ruler's failings wouldn't have been so decisive. But the years of Nicholas's reign were some of the most turbulent in history. The country had finally started the process of modernization and industrialization. This gave Russia some of the highest economic growth rates in the world. But the autocracy was unprepared and too incompetent to manage the transformation of Russian society. With the rapidly growing industrial working class and dramatic rates of urbanization, alongside continuing poverty and oppression, revolutionary sentiment now made a resurgence. New versions of old revolutionary parties reemerged, and new groups, like the Bolsheviks, grew out of the industrial age. As social tensions and mass impoverishment took a higher profile, Nicholas and his ministers decided to initiate a war with Japan. The Tsar's Minister of the Interior confided, "In order to hold back the tide of revolution, we need a short, victorious war." There was just one problem with this plan. The Russians weren't in a position to win the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. Instead, they suffered an embarrassing loss. As a result, the war aggravated social and economic tensions. When earlier Romanov rulers had previously faced such uprisings, the unrest traditionally occurred at the periphery, far from the center of government power. Not so in what became known as the Revolution of 1905. Now, more than 10,000 of St. Petersburg's industrial workers and printers went on strike. And on a Sunday morning, in January 1905, thousands of these workers and their families, along with tens of thousands of other Russian subjects, proceeded to the Winter Palace, led by an Orthodox priest named Father Gapon. The crowd was peaceful. The people had left their revolutionary banners at home as they'd been instructed. They'd brought no arms, only icons. They'd come to respectfully appeal to the Tsar about what he might do to ease their suffering. They consisted of men, women, and children. But as the people gathered at the Narva gates, just outside the palace, guards opened fire. Within minutes, more than 100 people lay dead. Hundreds more were injured in a tragedy remembered as Bloody Sunday. A tragic irony is that Nicholas II hadn't been in residence to receive the people's petition. He was with his family in the historic town of Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's village, south of St. Petersburg, home to the traditional summer residence. Still, in his absence, the monarch's carefully preserved image as the revered and trusted little father of the Russian masses had died along with the petitioners on Palace Square. The road to the Romanov dynasty's abdication was paved this January morning. 10 months later, in October 1905, a cascade of mutinies, protests, and rebellions culminated in a countrywide strike. Now, with Russia paralyzed, Nicholas II agreed to a series of reforms known as the October Manifesto. He promised to create a parliamentary body called the State Duma and to grant amnesty for political prisoners. And he affirmed the people's right to basic civil liberties. With this, the Revolution of 1905 promised a new age of constitutional rule. But by spring 1906, Nicholas had reclaimed some powers. He'd retained veto authority over the State Duma, making it unable to promote legislation or pass decrees that weren't in keeping with his wishes. And even though political prisoners had gained their freedom, new political opponents of the regime were taking their place. Violence increased rather than decreased. Revolutionary terrorists went on the offensive. In the first 8 months of 1906, 1,782 terrorist attacks claimed more than 1,300 lives. In response, Nicholas's government executed more than 3,000 people for political crimes over the next 5 years. Clearly, he faced monumental public challenges, but he also confronted private and personal challenges. The biggest was in his own family. After years of praying for a son, an heir to the throne, Nicholas and Alexandra had celebrated the birth of a son, Alexei, in 1904. He was named in honor of the first boy ever born to our reigning Romanov, the 17th century Zhar Alexei. With his birth, his parents believed that the dynasty would continue. But troubling signs appeared weeks later when the infant started bleeding from his navel. Alexei had hemophilia. Without the medical interventions that developed later in the century, hemophilia was a devastating, life-threatening condition. Any bump, bruise, or scrape could prove lethal. By the 1930s, it would be discovered that certain snake venoms, when diluted, caused blood to clot. And in 1937, Harvard's physicians published a paper describing anti-hemophilia globulin found in plasma, which could decrease clotting time. But for now, Alexei's precarious medical condition created the opening for the notorious Grigory Rasputin to enter the Romanovs' inner circle and the annals of Russian history. The Tsar's wife, Alexandra, made Rasputin's acquaintance through the recommendation of friends within St. Petersburg society. Rasputin himself was a peasant from Siberia and a self-proclaimed healer and holy man. His healing powers are questionable, and his claim to holiness unwarranted. He was a charlatan who clamored after power, money, and satisfaction of the most carnal kind. But the Romanovs, persuaded that Rasputin alone could heal and protect Alexei, became completely dependent upon him. Rasputin did produce a temporary remedy, like calming Alexei with some variant of hypnosis, just enough to allow his body time to heal. Unfortunately, Rasputin also used his ingratiating capacity to ruthlessly advance his own material and political positions. He slept with noble women and prostitutes alike. He tore through the streets of the capital in drunken and disorderly states. The Romanovs kept Alexei's vulnerable medical condition carefully hidden, but they couldn't keep Rasputin's horrid behavior under wraps. His sexual orgies and depravities were widely known and discussed. In the words of the historian Bruce Lincoln, sensible Russians found it difficult to retain even a modicum of respect for an empress who allowed into her presence a crude peasant whose outrageous escapades were known to them all. So, after the Revolution of 1905, this charlatan from Siberia sometimes known as the Mad Monk, irrevocably tarnished whatever mystique and charisma the Romanovs had retained. A few short years later, in July 1914, the murder of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in present-day Bosnia and Herzegovina touched off the outbreak of World War I, and the Russian people's patriotic fervor and dynastic appreciation was temporarily revived. 1 month after the Archduke's assassination, Russia invaded what was then East Prussia. But in 5 days of battle at Tannenberg, in present-day Poland, German forces slaughtered Russian troops. Only 10,000 out of 150,000 Russian soldiers escaped. Once the casualties mounted and the Russian people processed the emotional suffering and material deprivations of the poorly run war effort, the Zhar and his family were considered undeserving of continued adoration and support. In late 1916, a small group of aristocrats tried to save the Romanov dynasty. Among them were a cousin to the Tsar, a conservative member of the Duma, and Prince Felix Yusupov, who was among the richest men in the capital. All previous efforts to convince Nicholas and Alexandra to get rid of their disreputable advisor had failed. Any official or minister with principles enough to try to force Rasputin away from the royal family usually fell from power himself. So now, this conspiratorial group believed that the only hope was to murder Rasputin. Late on the evening of December 16, 1916, the conspirators lured Rasputin to the palace of the wealthy Prince Yusupov with the prospect of meeting the prince's young wife in an intimate setting. When Rasputin arrived, the conspirators told him that the princess was temporarily delayed, but they invited him to partake of some cakes and wine that were laced with copious amounts of cyanide. As Rasputin ate and drank, he seemed impervious to the poison. Determined to wait no longer, Yusupov excused himself and returned with a pistol. The prince shot the Tsar's advisor at point-blank range. The strange story of Grigory Rasputin wasn't over yet, however. As the conspirators celebrated, Rasputin rose and staggered past them towards the door. 2 more gunshots found their mark, and the Mad Monk collapsed. Among the conspirators was a doctor who assured the others that their target was finally dead. They bound his hands and pushed his body through a hole in the ice of the nearby canal. And when his body was discovered a few days later, Rasputin was dead at last. But an autopsy revealed that his lungs were filled with water. The medical evidence suggested that he'd survived the poisoning and the spray of bullets and died only from drowning. The Romanovs were inconsolable, but their own end was near as well. In March 1917, after a week of massive protests, Nicholas II abdicated the throne as the first revolution of 1917 reached its crescendo. After almost 304 years in power, the Romanov autocracy had come to an end. At least the family was still alive for the moment. Nicholas II found an element of relief and even happiness after the first revolution of 1917 and his abdication. Relieved of the duties and pressures of an office he was ill-suited for, he relished the days he spent at the Catherine Palace in Tsarskaya Selo with his family. The first revolutionary government, called the Provisional Government, treated the deposed monarch and his family well. This changed when a second revolution, led by Bolshevik radicals, established a new worker state. At this point, the Romanovs could feel the hostility of their captors towards them intensify, and their treatment deteriorated when opposition to the Bolsheviks and their Soviet government brought the country to a civil war. With the situation deteriorating, the Bolsheviks transferred the Romanov family first to Tobolsk in western Siberia, and then to the home of a former merchant in the Ural town of Ekaterinburg. The former Tsar, his wife, and their children, along with some trusted servants, were now prisoners of the new Bolshevik state. Optimistically, they awaited freedom, presumed to come through a literal king's ransom arranged by one of their relatives. Several were crowned heads of Europe. But early on the morning of July 17, 1917, family members were awoken with word that there was fighting nearby. Guards moved them to a basement room, telling them that it would be safer there. Instead, once the family assembled, armed Bolsheviks walked in and pronounced their death sentences. Each executioner had a designated target to avoid any mistake. When the shooting stopped, each of the Romanovs lay dead, except for the heir Alexei and the third oldest daughter Anastasia. They were wounded but alive. Now, the guards finished them off. Alexei died from 2 gunshots to the head. Anastasia was stabbed repeatedly with bayonets. The bodies were doused with sulfuric acid and buried in unmarked graves in an isolated rural area. There, they would remain for decades. Although an amateur investigator stumbled upon the scene in the 1970s, he remained quiet about his discovery until after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. With the archives sealed and the bodies unaccounted for, the mystery about the final days of the Romanov dynasty persisted for more than 7 decades.